Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming and adjusting your schedule a little bit. We learned yesterday afternoon that votes would be a little bit earlier than we thought, so we knew that Roger was a morning person, not. So we sent the word that we're going to start now instead of at 10 or 10:30. I'm Fred Upton. I'm chairman of this great committee, and we have awesome members and terrific staff for sure. And I want to introduce just a couple members that are not here on the panel. We have Brett Guthrie from Kentucky. We have Morgan Griffith in the back from Virginia. We have Chris Collins from New York. He was here a second ago, and we have Gus Bilirakis. And for those of you who know that name, his father Mike was chairman of the health subcommittee a lot of years ago in here, but Gus is from Florida. So I'm Fred Upton. I'm the lead sponsor with my friend Diana DeGette, and of course, we're here not to talk ourselves, us members, but to really listen to patients and families that struggle with these diseases where we have no cure. And as we know, the clock is ticking big time. And until we find a cure, that clock continues to tick, and sometimes the alarm goes off before it gets solved, and that's what we're here to fix. And, of course, as many of you know, we passed bipartisan legislation out of this committee, 51 to nothing, about a year ago, maybe 10 months ago now, 9 months ago, and later passed it in the House with 344 votes. We defeated the killer amendments. And we're waiting now for the Senate, and we have some good news. I'm going to let Frank tell a little bit about it next, and then Diana, and then we'll hear from the folks that are here. But the good news is that the Senate really is hearing our wake-up call. And though we started years before they did, as we listened to all of the different diverse groups that were out there, they've now done that too. And thanks to Lamar Alexander from Tennessee, the chairman of the Health Committee, and Patty Murray, his counterpart, they have begun to what we call mark up elements of what we did here in the House. Last month, they marked up about 10 or 12 smaller bills. They're on schedule to mark up another 10 or 12 bills the first week after Easter when the Senate returns. And the idea, of course, is then to combine those and bring it to the Senate floor, where their bill will not be too much different than our bill, but then we'll go to conference, and we'll take all the good parts in all these bills, and we'll put it as one, and our goal is to really get it to the president for him to sign. We're working with the administration, I should say. Yesterday I talked to the new FDA director, and he's very encouraged about what we're trying to do. Had breakfast with the Secretary of HHS earlier this week, and Sylvia Burwell has been a wonderful partner in this effort as well. But our goal really is to get it to the president before too many months go by, so that we'll provide the real hope, because it'll be the cure for all these patients. And so our job is to listen today about how this impacts them, these diseases that we don't have a cure for, and what it will mean to get this across the finish line. So with that, let me pass on just for a few moments to my friend Frank Pallone from New Jersey, and then Diana DeGette will clean up, and then we'll go to the participants who I'll name after Diana's finished. Frank?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Fred. Let me just say quickly that I want to thank Fred Upton, our chairman, and Diana DeGette, who's the ranking member of our Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee, because the effort to pass 21st Century Cures, which they sponsored on a bipartisan basis, was always a grassroots effort that they initiated, a people's effort, if you will. And today, I think, is an extension of that. They're not going to tell you, but they spent literally 2 or 3 years going around the country talking to average people. In other words, most of the time when we're trying to pass a bill, we have hearings here in this wonderful committee, and we have a markup, but it's pretty much a Washington phenomena. They were determined that this was going to be a phenomena of the grassroots out in the country as a whole, and they went all over the country having forums that were not your typical hearings, formal hearings, but rather just hearing from people. And I think that not only is today part of that, but I think that's how we get over the finish line here. It's only through efforts like yourselves and some of the grassroots organizations that you represent in many cases that we were able to get support for this and to get this bill passed overwhelmingly in the House and now in the Senate as well. Fred wanted me to mention a meeting that we had last week. The Vice President Biden, told us a few months ago or a few weeks ago that he wanted to get involved in making sure that this bill passed the Senate. As you know, he is the president of the Senate as the vice president. And he also had an initiative called Moonshot, which dealt with cancer and trying to find a cure for cancer, which President Obama has embraced as well. And so when we had our meeting last week at the White House, basically what we told the vice president, both us as well as Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray, who were our counterparts in the Senate, was that we wanted to marry the two bills. We wanted the Senate to act on not only cures, which they have, but also to include Moonshot and this cancer cures, if you will, initiative that the vice president has been championing. And everyone was on board with the idea that this needed to move in the Senate and would come over here, and then we go to conference the way Fred Upton described. So we really feel we have a lot of momentum here amongst members and with the White House. But again, I want to stress that Diana and Fred's goal from the very beginning was to be a more people, grassroots-oriented campaign for this. And that's why what your presence here is so important. Thank you, Fred.
As Diana takes, I want to introduce Billy Long from Missouri, who's also a parent of a daughter with cancer who's going to make it.
As the cleanup batter, let me just say a few words about what 21st Century Cures actually does. As you heard from Fred and Frank, we spent a year and a half going around the country talking to patients, talking to researchers. We worked closely with the administration and the agencies themselves, trying to figure out a way that we could bring cures much more quickly from the research lab to the clinic. And we were surprised in an era where everybody says things are broken in Washington, we were surprised at the amount of consensus that we found. And so what we came up with was a really meaty 350-page bill that we worked on step by step with the cancer and other advocacy organizations and with the administration itself to expedite the way we do research, clinical trials, the mapping of the genome, technology, all of those things are involved. But then we also realized that we needed funding because the funding had been flat or even reduced over the last number of years. So we put our meaty bill together, 350 pages. You'll be happy to know I'm not going to go through every section of the bill this morning. But we also then have an innovation fund targeted at giving money to the National Institutes of Health to help do this very, very important research. And it's mandatory spending for the NIH. We passed this bill through the House, despite everything, 344 to 77. And now, of course, you heard it's in the Senate. Lamar Alexander, Patty Murray, senators on both sides of the aisle are working hard on this. And they've announced not only are they going to do all the structural changes that we need to speed up the research, they also support the mandatory funding of the Innovation Fund. So we're very, very excited. We're also hoping that with the Vice President's help, we can increase the amount of the Innovation Fund to target not just diseases like neurological diseases, but also to put more money into cancer and other diseases. So this is all really good news, and it's only happening for one reason, and that reason is the advocacy groups. So I want to thank all of you for the work you've done to let your members of Congress across the country know how important this is for your families and for your communities. Fred and I often say, disease doesn't discriminate between Democrats and Republicans. It affects every family. It's affected all of our families. And so I just again want to say thank you. But we still need you to help us push this over the finish line. Fred and I think it needs to happen before the July 4th recess. You may have noticed that we're in a political season here, and we want to get this done as soon as possible. So thanks, and I'll turn it back over to Fred so we can hear from you.
Well, thank you both and my colleagues that are here. We're going to hear from probably the most famous person up here, Roger Daltrey, who's in town for a little event, fundraising event, maybe for him on Friday night at the Verizon Center with the WHO, but he's going to talk about Teen Cancer America. Simon Davies, the Executive Director of Teen Cancer America. Sarah Kennedy, who is the parent of 2 little girls with SMA, Spinal Muscular disease. Walter Witt. I know Walter White as well. I was with Bishop O'Connell, high school student with cystic fibrosis, and we have a number of students from Bishop O'Connell that are in the back as well. And Joel Wood, founder of the Foundation to Eradicate Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy disease. And in the front row, just to notice, we have Joel Wood's wife, Dana, and her son, James, who was diagnosed with Duchenne back in 2000. Walter Witt's parents, Walter and Lisa, and Dr. Nita Seibel, head of the Pediatric Solid Tumors Therapeutics at NIH Cancer Institute. And we are so grateful for all of the work that the NIH does and our firm commitment on a bipartisan basis to even give them more resources. So that, Roger?
Yeah, do you mind if I stand up?
You stand right. You go wherever you want.
You'll keep me awake. No, seriously, this is very early in the morning for me. I'm on tour. Usually we don't get up till 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So I would just be going to bed right about now. But I'm here really to speak on behalf of Teen Cancer America in support of this fantastic bill. This 21st Century Cures Act is so necessary. And I'm a Brit. I come from England. We are doing similar things over there. We're trying to get legislation on these issues. For the past 26 years in Britain, I have worked actively for the Teenage Cancer Trust. And we set out with a mission 26 years ago to improve the hospital experiences for teenagers with cancer. Because here we are, it's 2016, and in huge swathes of the economy, we recognize that this age group are very different, and they focus whole sections of the economy on this age group. They are sought after for their money, their input. When it comes to the hospital system, they are ignored. There is nothing. They are either children or they're adults. And as we know, they are too old to be children, treated as children, and they're too young to be treated as adults. When they enter the hospital system, they either, if they're under 18, they just go into with the children. I was in Chicago last week, and I was with a 15-year-old boy who had sarcoma in his leg, and he'd had to have a piece of his leg removed. He had spent 18 months in a hospital with 2 to 5-year-olds. That must have been mental torture to that boy. It just is so wrong. So what we set out to do in the Teenage Cancer Trust in Britain, we have built 30 hospitals which are totally for teenagers with cancer, where they can be together, they can share their experiences, share their troubles. The best psychologist for a teenager with cancer is another teenager with cancer. You put them together, magical things happen. Also, we've found by doing this that we've got adolescent oncologists and adult oncologists working together side by side. So they can kind of mix the medicine. Because a lot of these drugs, this stuff that they use for leukemias and things like that, it's shooting in the dark. They don't really know. And we've found by accident huge improvements in treatments by giving adolescents, when they turn 18 and will normally move on into an adult hospital, by giving them an adolescent dose of a leukemia therapy, there's huge improvements in the success of that. So these things are happening by accident. So what we need to do, we need to isolate this group within the hospital system, because at the moment, they're not there. They're not there at all. and until you do isolate them, you will not be able to focus the research into this age group. And it really does need focusing. They tend to get the rarest of all cancers because they're so active. They suffer most from late diagnosis. They also, all along the line, it's a bad result for them. If they're put in with children, it's bad for the children, it's bad for them. If they're put in with adults, it's bad for the adults. I mean, I can't imagine being next to an 18-year-old. It would be a nightmare for me. We would have nothing in common. It would be very difficult to share our emotions and talk about it. There's the issue of the parents who have got nowhere to unload their problems. You look in the eyes of a teenager and their parents, the teenagers, they're fantastic. They say, bring it on. We'll take it on the chin. But the parents are in terror. They're frozen. There's nowhere for them to go, nowhere for them to share their load. By putting them together in a hospital ward, we have had huge improvements in this. And I would really sincerely hope you get this through. You really deserve it, America. Your young people, and it's not just, I mean, I came to speak about teen cancer, but young James here, you know, there's so many diseases where James is 18 years old. He should not be in a hospital with 5-year-olds. He should not be anywhere near them. It's wrong. You wouldn't do it in your prison system. You wouldn't put him in, you know, next year he's going to be 19 and he would be put in with adults. It's wrong. Change it. And your medicine will improve leaps and bounds with a very simple movement of organisation in your hospital system. Anyway, I do wish you all the best with this. Please get it through. Pull your finger out, Senate. I can say that. I'm a Brit.
We'll give you a standing O. All right. You're going to have to come back for an encore. Simon?
Well, you started a tradition of standing up now. Simon Davis, Executive Director of Teen Cancer America. I've been over here for 3 years now. I was Chief Executive of the charity in the UK that was developing these services, Teenage Cancer Trust, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I want to equally add my support for what you're trying to achieve. I think this acceleration, discovery, and development and the delivery of these drugs needs to be brought into the 21st century, and that's what you're doing. And believe me, this isn't just going to be a US initiative. This will have an impact right across the world, and we really applaud that. And I can't urge the Senate more strongly to make this happen quickly, because as we were saying earlier, every day is a day that matters to these young people and their families. So Roger's said many of the things that I would say, and I'm here just to support that. I just want to say in the context of what you're trying to achieve, you know, this is a marginalized group. They are between silos, and that the fact that they have had poorer outcomes and survival than both children and older people means that there's something going wrong there, and we need to address that. And that's what we're trying to do by bringing these specialist facilities, these treatments, these teams together, specialist teams, and making sure that the research is right. And we want to focus on that. We're talking about late onset pediatric cancers and early onset adult cancers. Makes it difficult for people to treat, makes it difficult for researchers to understand. And so in combining those forces, as Roger said, and bringing them together, it's really going to make a difference. They have unique biological differences. These are young people going through growth spurts, hormonal changes. Who knows whether the drugs that have been tested on 60-year-olds are going to be the right drugs for a growing body. So we need to check that out. We need to make sure that we're getting that right. And by enhancing the patient experience, and as Roger has said, the best therapy for a young person is another young person. By enhancing those facilities and those treatment teams and that experience for those young people, that will inspire researchers. And that's what we've seen in the UK, that where there was nobody taking an interest in this age group, now they are. Now they're working with them, now they're taking an interest, and now the researchers are doing something about it. And the challenge, of course, is as you want to cure, of course we want to cure, but it's also about survival. It's also about the long-term needs of these young people, whether it's cancer or the other diseases that are affecting them. They're going to have to deal with the ravages of that illness over many years to come. And so the survival in that experience is just as important. So we believe that young people deserve that focus on their health needs, just as they have in other parts of society. But I cannot say strongly enough, as Roger has said as well, this initiative that you're putting through is so important. And well, I'll join you in saying, come on, Senate, get your finger out. Thank you.
Sarah Kennedy, tell us your story.
Hi, I'm Sarah Kennedy, and I have two daughters, ages 6 and 8. We're constituents of Mr. Upton, and this is a picture of them a little while back when we met with him for the first time, or one of the first times. And they both have been diagnosed with spinal muscular atrophy. And spinal muscular atrophy is the #1 genetic cause of infant mortality. And so to get that diagnosis is just heartbreaking. There's no treatment, there's no cure for the disease. When we got the diagnosis, my daughter was 16 months old, and she was able to sit independently and crawl independently, but not walk independently. And that's when we kind of had the first signs that something was wrong. And when we did get the diagnosis, my husband was getting ready to deploy with the Army to Afghanistan. So we got the diagnosis 5 days before he left, and that was one of the worst times of my life. Our youngest daughter was born three weeks early, and we had just learned about the diagnosis of our oldest daughter. And then we also learned that it's a genetic disease. There's a 25% chance that our child would be affected because my husband and I are both unknowing carriers of the disease. So we had the choice of waiting it out to see if she might lose strength or to get her tested. And of course, I couldn't wait it out. I wanted to get her tested right away. And then we found out that she also was diagnosed with the disease. And spinal muscular atrophy is a disease where it takes away all the voluntary muscle movement, and it's a slow, progressive disease. So it hinders the ability to just sit up in a chair and keep their balance, or even eating. It takes them a very long time to eat. My youngest daughter is on she has a feeding tube, so she has a feeding pump at night that helps her to eat. And they're both currently in wheelchairs because they can't walk independently. So as a caretaker for, my husband is back home now. He went to Afghanistan, and I guess where I was going with that was he met another soldier who was really good friends with a leading neurologist at the Children's Hospital of Boston. And he was so nice. He was able to get the neurologist's phone number, and then they'd pass it on to me. And he said, bring your daughter into the clinic. I'd be happy to see her and evaluate her. And so there were no clinics near us at that time. So I packed her up, and we went to Boston and took her to the clinic and got a wealth of information. And I'm so thankful for that, because on the internet, when you look around and you see all the things about the disease, and you just kind of see the grim details of survival. So just thinking about like back at that time when we got the diagnosis for both the girls, and just trying to get through each day and try to figure out how are we going to make it through this disease, and how are we going to help them with their strength. I always would rock them to sleep and think about, this is such a rare disease. Anyone I tell about it has never heard of it before. And I just hoped that somehow I would be able to spread the word about this disease to other people so they would get to know about it. And I'm so thankful to be here And I'm so thankful that all of you are interested in hearing about this and that we can get through this legislation to find cures and treatments for diseases like this. Thank you.
Walter?
Yes. First of all, I just want to thank you, all for inviting me. It's such an honor to be here. I was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis pretty much right when I was born, so back in 1997. And at that time, the life expectancy for the disease, for CF, was about 25 years old. So if you think about it, I'm 18 right now. And, of course, that was really difficult for my parents. Essentially, what cystic fibrosis is, it's a genetic disease that targets a specific gene. And what it really does is it prevents me from processing the mucus that builds up in my lungs. So maybe if you're feeling sick, you might have noticed you're coughing more kind of mucus up. I'm unable to filter that mucus out. And so essentially what happens, it creates a breeding ground in my lungs for bacteria. And so of course when you're young, you're exposed to a number of different germs. Those develop, and they can, what ends up happening is it can lead to very serious lung infections. And of course, since it's genetic, it does get progressively worse. So I was very fortunate, kind of the first 5 or 10 years or so of my life, I was able to remain relatively healthy because of the treatments that had already been developed. Kind of going into the treatments that I do each day, I wake up at about 5:45 before school each day to do about an hour of chest physical therapy. And so I didn't bring it with me, but I put on a big inflatable vest, and that vibrates for about half an hour. And the idea is that will break up some of the mucus that's built up in my lungs, especially overnight. Kind of going alongside that, I do a series of inhalers. And again, the idea is that breaks up the mucus. And so it keeps me coughing more of that stuff out, and preventing, of course, lung infections and anything that's kind of growing or developing there. And so I do that twice a day for about 2 to 3 hours each day. That's been really difficult, kind of, going to high school and trying to plan my life around that. And so I said probably for about 5 or 10 years, that was enough to really keep me healthy. And it was really only until I turned 13, pretty much in 8th grade, where I first began to experience kind of the progression of cystic fibrosis. So the way they measure my lung health is through a percentage. And so you'd say 100% is a normal percentage. And at that time, I'd been very fortunate, I said, and it was about 110%. Throughout 8th grade, I watched that number drop to about 90% in 1 year. So this was the first time I really saw that decline and the full effect of the disease. I ended up being hospitalized for about 2 weeks, along with 4 weeks after of intensive IV antibiotics. And so I was fortunate, at the time I was able to recover. I was still only 13. This was the first time I was been hospitalized. Many kids with CF are hospitalized much sooner. And so I kind of rationalized it. And I said, it's just a bump in the road. I can kind of keep going. I can recover. And so actually probably within that next year and a half, I was again hospitalized. And that's really where I began to realize, this is what cystic fibrosis is going to be like going into adulthood. Because like I said, it is a progressive disease. And so for the first time, probably the start of high school, so this is probably my freshman year, I began to, of course, take a more active role and approach to my health. But again, I kind of rationalized it. I said, every year I'll go to the hospital. I'll spend, 1 or 2 weeks doing IVs, kind of getting a tune-up, as they call it in the CF world. And so I was okay with that, and I was kind of able to adapt to it. What I didn't realize is that, of course, 4 years, that was 4 years ago, as the time would progress, this would get worse. And so I ended up watching, this was probably through junior year, probably my most difficult year. I ended up watching my lung function drop to about 86%. So over the past 4 years, I had seen really about a 20% decrease in my lung function. Of course, you try to rationalize that and you try to work around it and keep fighting. But there's a point where you really do have to face the fact. I talked about life expectancy. Right now, that number is, I believe, at around 37 years old. So I have to face the fact that that's really kind of that progression for me. So kind of reached probably the most important point for me during my senior year. So again, I kind of adapted. This was one morning in October, of course, during college applications and all the stress of senior year. I ended up waking up able to breathe at that time. And so this is probably 4 in the morning. I was really scared. I'd never seen this. Anything that I had to deal with CF had been a progression over time. And so this was the first time where it wasn't just intense, but it was a shock, and there was no progression there. I didn't see my lung function drop, over the course of weeks. It was within hours. And so I ended up having to go to the emergency room, and, again, I realized these are the things I'm going to have to adapt to. So looking at it and kind of the bright side of the story and my experiences with cystic fibrosis, and it's really changed really within even the last 6 months are the new medications that have been released. I started a new drug in August, and it's really taken its full effect really right about now. That's actually targeting the genetic defect associated with cystic fibrosis, the delta F508 gene. So even just from starting that, just from being on it, this is specialized medicine. Just from being on it, I've seen my lung function go back to about 95%, and I haven't needed to be in the hospital since this last June. So it's really been amazing just to see the impact that medication has had on my life. It really has been life-changing. So I want to thank you all, just for inviting me. It's been such an honor. So thank you.
Joel?
Chairman Upton and Congresswoman DeGette
You
and
can call me
Congressman
Fred.
Malone, thank you so much. I always knew, Mr. Chairman, that all those years out in the scorching southern sun in the Humboldt High School marching band and the Ole Miss marching band, that someday I would sit on the stage. I'd be on the stage with Roger Daltrey. So it's a great honor. As you mentioned, my son James, my best friend, my hero. I was reminded when Sarah was talking about that grim day in 2000 when we sat in that room at Children's National Medical Center, and we were told that James had Duchenne muscular dystrophy, a historically untreatable, brutal disorder. And the first thing that happened at the time, because a lot of times the mothers are also unknowing carriers, is the local head of the Muscular Dystrophy Association, who's Annie Kennedy with the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, sitting in the front row here. She showed up, which should have been a bad sign to us that what was going to be. We're going to be told, and Dana was 9 months pregnant, and the first thing they do is they looked over, and we're like, it's a girl, and ours is solely a disease of boys. So it's brutal. I will tell you, when we came into this, all the resources that were spent on Duchenne muscular dystrophy were, almost all of them, were spent on offsetting the tremendous costs of care, not on so much on research and virtually nothing on advocacy. At the frame of reference, when we came into it, all the muscular dystrophies at NIH were getting about $17 million. This is a $32.3 billion budget today. 17 million, the decimal does. Now, thanks to the Muscular Dystrophy Care Act, actually it was Mike Bilirakis was the chairman of the health subcommittee, and Sherrod Brown was then the ranking member of the health subcommittee, and that changed the landscape for our disease. And today, we've got about $75 million worth of funding through NIH. But I will tell you, and it's still, and we've got great partners there and at the FDA. But I will also say that, one of the things that I've always learned about the 4 pillars of funding at NIH is that it's based on severity, prevalence, need, and opportunity. severity, world's #1 genetic, right up there with SMA, lethal childhood genetic disease. Prevalence there, it's completely brutal. Need, historically no treatments whatsoever, and scientific opportunity, readily identifiable flaws on a single gene. By all of those measures, I'm tempted to use language that Donald Trump would use on how these kids are treated. And so we desperately need the 21st Century Cures Act to bring up NIH funding, but also all of these things that sound so obscure to so many, like surrogate endpoints and biomarkers and all of the sort of this nascent field of patient-driven drug discovery that this act would boost. These are things that are real, and they're desperately needed in our community. And so I'm very hopeful that this moonshot, we all benefit. SMA, cystic fibrosis, we're among the single gene defect diseases like hemophilia and Tay-Sachs syndrome and a couple of others that you're familiar with. As soon as they can figure out how to fix that one gene, they'll be able to fix it. If you look at cancer and this field of personalized genetic medicine that this legislation does so much to advance, we're going to rapidly get to that point. On that card, you point out that there are 10,000 identified diseases, 7,000 of which are rare, only 500 treatments that are in the marketplace. We're going to rapidly get to the point to where every disease is a rare disease because of that personalized genetic care. And so we have a great opportunity here. I'm very hopeful that this moonshot will be able to benefit from the cancer side, because that, I think, may be what drives the Senate action to getting to the finish line on this. It's just desperately needed. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you all for your stories. And just to underscore about the moonshot, as we explained to the vice president who accepted it, was we want to get to the moon. We want the moonshot to win, and we already have the rocket ship that's already been launched and passed in the House, and now with the legislative calendar, we can get this thing to home plate when we get it done. Let me ask a question of each of you, and then I'll let Frank and Diana ask a question. So, as from my perspective, first coming onto this committee in '91, getting on the health subcommittee as I did, and watching the cures for diseases, I can remember, Joel, when CF was, it took 15% of your lung capacity every year, and the life expectancy was not really much older than 12 or 13 for many kids. And we have seen great, the FDA approved some new drugs in the last 2 years, and literally almost half of the folks now can be identified with that gene and see a much more normal life with the sun coming up big time for the rest. Duchenne, I can remember, again, same story, and now we're seeing real progress that's been made, in large part because of what Mike Bilrakis and Sherrod Brown did here with all of our support. You served with Sherrod, right? She's the young woman on our committee, yeah. Versus the old timers, Frank and myself. And SMA, a disease certainly that I never heard of until you came with your 2 daughters to my Kalamazoo office and learned a lot about it. So we have this bill provides the hope, and we can see that it's going to take us around the right corner to get it
Chairman,
done.
I will tell you, in our world, we've expanded life expectancy even without a Duchenne-specific treatment. I think we're going to be seeing a couple that are going to be coming online here in the next year or two. One, Marathon Pharmaceuticals, has a drug that we ship in from the UK legally now. It's not available here. But life expectancy is up over a decade, and there wasn't a dime of a drug company or a biotech being invested in this disease when my kid was diagnosed. Not a dime. And today we have, thanks to just that, what we've been able to do with the MD Care Act, we've got $4 billion worth of investment from 40 different drug companies at various stages of the process. So when you talk about the value of the investment, wow, it just really underscores how essential this legislation is.
So here's my brief question. So you all are very engaged in the disease that impacts your family. How well do you think your peers, those folks, families with fighting the same battle you are, how well aware do you think they are of our effort here to find resolve and the effort then to work on our colleagues in the Senate to get it done?
Well, I will say, look, it's tough. You got, what, 400 some odd pages. This is, some of this is, that back and forth, that all of these risk-benefit controversies with respect to the FDA and the allocation of resources. This is tough stuff for people to get a handle on. And historically, Congress has not dictated, for all kinds of good reasons. This would be like Mother Teresa's waiting room out in the hallway if you were to specifically allocate every dollar for every different disorder. But we've not kept up pace with the potential for scientific innovation. Legislation has not kept up pace. And this is honestly, if you look at the severity of our disorder and the costs associated with it, it's a market failure. And we really desperately do need the legislation to move it forward. And I think the awareness is getting there, but I think also the clock is ticking. It's every day, and I think we have a great opportunity here in the next window of the next couple of months.
Joel?
Can I just add to that, Fred? I think that one of the real challenges that there's been around the world, and I know it's here in America, is the regulatory system and the structure in which these innovations are developed. And what I find very good about your legislation is you're trying to streamline that, because for parents it's about the speed it takes for a drug to get to marketplace, and for these young people as well. And I think by concentrating the effort there and changing that regulatory system to make it more streamlined and give those young researchers the best chance that they can, that's what I think is a real value.
Follow up on that. Right now in the U.S., the average age of the first grant from the NIH for a young researcher is 42. I always tell people that's young for Congress, not so young when you're trying to get a research grant. And so that's one of the things we do in the 21st Century Cures Bill. And the only other thing I want to comment is that one of the things that's so important about 21st Century Cures is this precision medicine component, where you really can have researchers looking at specific genetic components of diseases. This is true with cystic fibrosis, with cancer, with so many diseases. And the cystic fibrosis story is an important story that needs to be told. I was just mentioning it to Roger. What happened was the cystic fibrosis advocacy community hired a researcher who found the gene, who got approval for the clinical trials to do the precision medicine research around that gene, and then that's when they were able to find out that treatment that reverses so many of the disease impacts for the people, for the percentage of patients who have that. He now is about to come forward with his next research around a different genetic component for different people with cystic fibrosis. He thinks by the end of the next couple of years, he'll have drugs that virtually cure cystic fibrosis in half of the patients or more. That's extraordinary if you listen to these stories. But we can do that for every disease, and that's what 21st Century Cures is. So it's so gratifying to see someone like you sitting here to talk about how it's impacting your personal life.
Say, because I do think that a lot of people really aren't aware of exactly what we're trying to do with 21st Century Cures, or with Moonshot for that example. Because, it does sound very bureaucratic. It's a lot of pages. But it just 3 or 4 things that I think I would like to throw out for those who may or may not be aware. There's the money component, which obviously is very important, because we want to provide significantly more money for research than we've had in the last few years. In terms of of drug approvals, it is true that the effort does involve streamlining approval of drugs, but I also, urge a little caution there, because we do have those, even though this is a bill that's overwhelmingly supported by most members, there are some who did not vote for it, and they were under, I think, the false impression that when we talk about streamlining, somehow we're cutting corners for safety with regard to drug approvals. And I need to stress that that is not the case. I mean, both the FDA have said that. We believe strongly that we're putting together something that streamlines the effort so approvals do get done faster, but not in a way that cuts corners for safety. So I think that's important. A lot of people, when I talk to them back at home, think that this is primarily oriented towards clinical trials, because when Diana and Fred went around, a lot of the grassroots effort, or the people that came at these various forums, talked about expanding clinical trials. I mean, there is an element of that certainly as well. There was another thing I wanted to mention, but it now eludes me, I'll stick to those three. I mean, there are a lot of different aspects of this that, need to be, the public needs to be made aware of, that, because I think when you say 21st century cures, people aren't necessarily aware of exactly what we're up to. So, those are at least some of the things that come to mind.
If I could mention,
Sure.
Congressman, for example, all these expanded, these surrogate endpoints. Every clinical trial for every kid with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, most all of them, have not included non-ambulatory kids. The measurement has been the 6-minute walk test. What's that going to do for us? And so the expansion on that front is really interesting. And also, we've got a big appetite when you've got a lethal disorder with no treatment for risk. And nobody here, no one in our community is suggesting that we want dangerous trials. No one is suggesting but there's so much that this act does to advance it. The one major drug that all these kids take is corticosteroids. Prednisone came onto the market in 1950. Anti-inflammatory, used for so many disorders. All these kids are jacked up on it, and all of them suffer terrible consequences for it. We're not so sure that there's all kinds of bad side effects on prednisone, and scientists historically didn't even really understand how it was working. I'm not so sure that prednisone could have gotten approved in today's regulatory environment with the FDA because of that. We talk really big as a society about our war on disease, but our willingness to encounter any casualties is extremely small. And I get that safety is number one. It is in this legislation, but we've also got to modernize and put together.
And the one thing that I didn't mention actually relates to Moonshot more than 21st century. But as I said, we're trying to marry these two, based on our conversations with the Vice President. With Moonshot, and this isn't really legislative necessarily, or there might be a legislative element, what the Vice President talks about is an executive order or executive actions that would try to make sure that the research for cures, if you will, he's talking primarily in terms of cancer and Moonshot, but it would apply to all cures, is done in such a way that it's shared. In other words, one of the fears is that different researchers or different departments do research, and it's not shared, and we're not as successful in moving forward with cures because the research is sort of done in isolation. And so one of the things that he talks about in the context of Moonshot is to get rid of those barriers, if you will, where people are sharing research and sharing innovation and sharing thoughts. And that's another way of moving forward in terms of cures and Moonshot.
So, Joe, you talked a little bit about prednisone, which is used for a lot of different things. My wife has had a blood anemic disorder, and prednisone was the only thing that was used, and so ultimately we figured out something else. But as you think about your role as a parent, Walter, you're in essence an adult for sure, and Sarah, your role as a parent as well. How well, what ideas do you have in terms of how is the patient's experience, whether it be on prednisone or how is that being interpreted by the FDA? And can we enhance that? Is there some effort that you're able to come
I can
back
certainly say in
to
the
the researchers?
in the Duchenne community, Mr. Chairman, we've got also in the front row is my friend Buddy Cassidy. He's 25 years old with Duchenne. He served on the first patient, he was on an advisory panel for a specific drug that was up for the FDA. And and this was, I think, the first time ever you had a patient and a parent representation on the FDA advisory board. We need a whole lot more of that kind of an experience. And so it's coming together. You know, we just do, look, I think of somebody like Roger Daltrey who's come into this. He didn't have to do any of this. He's walked the walk. I mean, when I looked it up, I mean, it was like 30 million pounds that he's raised for this cause. All of us, this was forced upon us. You know, we were involuntarily thrust into this. And so you just do, everybody has, you know, you try to allocate your resources. You have a finite amount of emotional, political, and physical capital, and you try to do the best that you can. And so many in our community do that, but I will tell you it is a terrible burden, especially for those who don't have an awful lot. And there's a lot of big disincentives as well with like the Medicaid system. You know, how do you have a 24/7 patient personal assistant if you have a job because you won't qualify for Medicaid? So these are deep challenges, and we're just grateful that we found so much receptivity in this committee and to find such an unusual circumstance of bipartisan harmony. But we got to turn it into law.
In terms of the work with the FDA and how you see them react with patients themselves?
Yes, I think just in terms of kind of, I guess, access to medication is more. Where the difficulties come in for us is more with the health insurance companies once the medications are actually approved. I know we had some difficulties, and this was, you know, of course, 15 or 16 years ago, with actually getting the vest I described, simply because at that point in my life, I was too healthy to receive that treatment.
To touch on the part about the shortening clinical trials to like the bigger picture for us, we don't have a lot of time. For our daughters, the life expectancy is not great. So, you know, the longer the clinical trials run, the children might not make it, and not because of the clinical trial drug, but just because of their life expectancy, and they may not be able to live long enough to be able to receive that cure or treatment. So anything that we can do to speed it up, and like you said, it would be safe, would be very, very helpful. And, you know, the patient voice is also extremely beneficial, I'm sure.
That I would maybe ask Roger and Simon. You talked a little bit about the special challenges facing teen cancer patients, and I'm wondering if you can talk, maybe Simon and obviously Roger too, but if you can talk a little bit about cancer research, and you mentioned this in your opening statements a little bit, but why it's important to have research targeted specifically at that age cohort with cancer, because that's one thing we try to work on also in 21st Century Cures is precision medicine targeted at that patient. What would be the reason to do that?
And just one other thing to follow up on that, and maybe, you know, Roger, since you've done so much in the last number of years, the progress that you have seen yourself from what got you started, where we are today, your continuing commitment, the progress that you've seen, be interested in that too.
Well, it's rather interesting because ours was a really simple idea. It was just to improve the whole hospitalized experience for that age group. But what we feel and we know medically that a psychologically and socially happy patient will have better chances of survival. That's a fact. So we have observed improvements. We haven't got them journalised yet. It's in the process of that. As you know, that's an extremely long process. But we do know that this is improving the outcomes. And as I said earlier, by just having the different sides of medicine, the adult and the adolescent working side by side, accidents happen and progress is made. So I would love to see whole sections of hospitals where young people, adolescents and young adults up to the age of 25 have their own separate piece of the hospital where they mix together. They can talk, they can converse, the medicine can mix. I think you will come up with some surprising results because the researchers will mix as well. At the moment, it's just it's a mess. It's for their children or their adults, and there's no, for the age group in between, the in-betweeners, there is nothing. There are no lounges. You would expect a nursery for a child. You would expect an adult lounge. For this age group, where they're into all, we think we understand them. We don't. They're separate. There is no facilities at all for them. Absolutely nothing. We are providing that as a charity. We've been going 4 years. We're in 10 of the major hospitals in America, including Sloan Kettering, CHOP in Philadelphia, UCLA out in Los Angeles, Dana-Farber, Moffitt down in Tampa. And we've got 50 hospitals queuing up. They recognise the need, but somehow or the other, we could do with a little bit of help from instruction from you guys. You know, just this is needed in our country now. You know, they are not children and they are not adults. They're very different.
And I think, in answer to your question as well, the fact that these are rare diseases that we're talking about, it's rare cancers, and I know that's an emphasis on your legislation, is looking at the rarity of disease, and it makes them, as I said earlier, the difficulty of treating them when they're going through hormonal changes and growing bodies, and we need to understand better how we can impact that. And by creating these kind of specialist services and the specialist services that the other disease groups here are looking at, you know, we will see we will see those improvements coming, and we've started to see them emerging just through simple collaborations. But now there's dedicated research happening, and with the type of legislation that you're putting forward, that's really going to make a big difference, and that will be, you know, a historical moment. You know, this is a potential game changer. So we're looking forward to seeing the outcomes of that and playing our part in it, and we look for your support.
Well, thank you all. You know, we've said it from the beginning. You know, the clock is ticking. If not now, when? And it's even more appropriate to say, if not us, who? Yeah, just came, and it was not staff written. Just came. I want to thank everybody for spending an hour with us today. I really appreciate the folks that came so far, hundreds and thousands of miles, literally, to be with us, to share their experience. And we are reinvigorated, and we will push on till it's done. So appreciate everybody's time today. Thank you, thank you, thank you.